With low power cartridges and small diameter bullets, even if you damage a major organ or artery, it may take minutes or hours for an assailant to die from this wound. During this time, an assailant may be functioning well enough to still kill you. All of these rounds obviously had enough penetration, so the only real problem was the fact that they didn't make a larger wound. On this chart we have a lot of people killed with 32s and only a few killed with 22s. I would assume that there is some sort of selection bias going on here. I say this because we can look at other statistics that show more people have been shot with 22s than with 32s. We can notice correlations but not determine causation with information like this. Also, even with large diameter, powerful non-expanding bullets, animals can still take a long time to die even if the shot placement is good. Regardless if it's small bullets being used on humans or large bullets being used on medium-sized game, non-expanding bullets that do relatively little damage do have the ability to kill quickly. It's just that they don't do this reliably enough. Expanding rounds are simply much more of a guarantee of a quick death. You also may be asking, how often is it that people shot with 22s are not quickly incapacitated? Greg Elfritz did a handgun caliber study and found that 31% of people shot with 22s were not quickly incapacitated. I keep saying quickly incapacitated because Elfritz's definition of incapacitation is pretty narrow, with the attacker having to fall within 5 feet if moving, or having to cease the violent activity to be qualified as incapacitated. So an attacker who drops dead after running 6 feet would not be labeled as incapacitated. Likewise, an attacker who is not physically incapacitated by his wounds, but decides to give up, would still be considered incapacitated by this definition. If we want to know the percentage of people who aren't being physically incapacitated after being shot with 22s, that sort of information is not readily available. We can say that of the 22 rifle shootings one person has seen, all of them have been homicides instead of attempted homicides. He also said that they didn't go far after being shot either. So yes, people can be quickly incapacitated with 22s. Every now and then you hear a story about someone getting shot with a 22 or 25 and the bullet fails to penetrate the skull. Apparently Jim Andrews had to arrest a Nazi in 1945, but this didn't quite go as planned. Even after the Nazi had been shot twice with a 45, he still shot Jim in the forehead with the 25 ACP. Thankfully, Jim lived to tell the tale. This quote also implies that Jim Andrews was going to make some pithy comment about the effectiveness of 45 Full Metal Jacket, but ultimately didn't say anything. Obviously this is the exception and not the rule, because a lot of people who have been shot in the head with small calibers like 25 and 22 do not survive. These are 2 shootings that involved chest wounds with 22 rifles. One person lived and the other died. In both cases, the victim was either unconscious or dead before they could get to the hospital. In other words, if an assailant is hit in the chest with a 22 and that causes serious damage, regardless if he ultimately survives or not, it's only a matter of time before he becomes incapacitated. How long actual physical incapacitation will take is very hard to predict. It could be minutes or hours. This is a problem for the folks who do autopsies and try to solve crimes, as victims may be performing various activities as normal, suddenly feel tired, and then only realize that they've been shot. With a gunshot wound of any caliber, the assailant will feel lightheaded from blood loss and either fall down or want to sit/lay down. As the effects of adrenaline begin to wear off and they begin to bleed out more, they'll feel progressively worse and generally cold as body heat escapes. In one officer's experience, chest wounds with the 22 long rifle generally don't result in any exiting bullets. 22s don't have a lot of momentum and they're generally made out of soft lead, so when they lose a great deal of their momentum, they become easily deflected and hardly any of the rounds exit the rear of the chest cavity. More powerful cartridges like the 380 will be able to penetrate through someone in roughly a straight line. This is a Full Metal Jacket bullet that passed through the back of a victim as he was trying to flee his house. It bounced off of a door frame and was found inside the home. It's not a very good picture, but it appears to be an average 9mm bullet. If you want to hear more of the details about this case, it's from the show Crime 360, Season 2, Episode 15. As I've mentioned in another video, from a statistical level, we can say that more powerful cartridges, like .38 Special, are more effective in real-world shootings than .25s or .22s. However, we may want to have a smaller, less bulky handgun as we go about mundane household tasks. Even when you are home, you are not entirely safe. To illustrate this point, I want to mention an incident that was detailed in Werner Herzog's documentary, Into the Abyss. A woman who was alone at home baking cookies. She was shot and killed by men who entered her house. This happened in a wealthy gated community, by the way. With .22s and .25 ACP handguns, you always want to use non-expanding rounds, preferably copper-plated or full metal jacket rounds. This is to limit unintentional deformation upon striking thick bone. Such rounds will have enough penetration to reach vitals, but may still be deflected by bone with a bad angle. .380 ACP and .38 Special are not inherently bad cartridges, but you do have to put much more consideration into what ammo you're using. First of all, it's far more important to have adequate penetration than to just have expansion. This does not mean you should only use full metal jackets in your .380. It means that for .380, you want to be ideally using extreme defender type rounds. While these bullets don't actually expand, they do cause damage that is on par with a hollow point, and most importantly, they have good penetration. However, these are fairly expensive, and I doubt many of them are stocked on store shelves. If you can't find any of these, your next best bet would be to use conventional hollow points like Federal's HydroShock Deep. Hornady's XTPs would also be a close second. I go into more detail about different rounds and their performance in my .380/22 video if you're interested. In general, I would assume that any given hollow point, whether .380 or .38 Special, lacks sufficient penetration until proven otherwise. Essentially, you shouldn't trust your life to a round that's unproven. If you have a .38 Special with a pretty short barrel, like around 2 inches, you'd want to use the TAC XP ammunition made by Buffalo Bore. TAC XP also works well with longer barrels. But if you can't find any, you may be forced to use non-expanding bullets to have enough penetration. Even if you use a wad cutter or wide flat-nosed bullet, the damage is still marginal. Round-nosed bullets are worse. Flesh and ballistics gel tends to slip around the round nose and leave a pretty small wound. I would not use them unless you have no other choice. However, even with .380 hollow points that expand a lot, like Spear Gold Dots, they still have a significant chance of exiting the body. Most people, when they hear this, may be concerned and fear that the bullet could harm a bystander. However, when these bullets exit, they have very little force when this happens, and they probably would have been found inside the clothing of the intended target if he happened to be wearing more layers. This isn't something that's specific to .380 or to Gold Dots, but rather it's a consequence of using expanding bullets on a living creature. This is a chart showing the energy density of a projectile that is needed to penetrate various parts of the human body 50% of the time. The units are in joules per square millimeter. I admit that this isn't that relevant, but I thought it was interesting and would help prove a point. People aren't made of a single consistent substance, so some rounds may have just enough energy left to exit, while other rounds of the same kind will be retained by skin or clothing. The same thing can happen with rifle bullets if you shoot large game. Even if you shoot the same rounds into a very consistent substance like ballistics shell, some rounds will travel slightly further than others of the same kind. Practically speaking, full metal jackets in .380 are noticeably less likely to overpenetrate and cause injury to bystanders than with more powerful cartridges. However, full metal jackets are unquestionably more likely to cause collateral damage and unquestionably less damaging than a good hollow point round. With .380s, I should also say that flat-nosed full metal jackets are particularly bad for self-defense. Even though they do somewhat more damage, they noticeably increase the chance of overpenetration. Also, flat-nosed bullets have a higher chance of failing to feed reliably than more rounded-nosed bullets. Regardless of caliber, Spear Gold Dots tend to have a lot of expansion. This is a real problem for calibers like .380 or .38 Special, because it results in marginal penetration. I'd also like to make the point that .380 just doesn't have any really significant advantages over 9mm. You can get a small 9mm just like you can get a small .380, so size is really a non-issue. Size would be more of an issue if we're comparing a .38 special handgun to a .357 Magnum. In general, if you're looking for a small handgun, I'd get a 9mm. I'd only really consider a revolver if you want a cheap .22, or if someone doesn't have enough hand strength to rack the slide of a pistol. The stated goal of the .30 Super Carry was to bridge the gap between 9mm and .380. In my eyes, that's a goal that will inherently limit it to being a niche round. Its only real benefit is that it has more capacity when all guns are of a similar size, and as soon as someone realizes that they can make a smaller gun in 5.7, it may have significant competition in that category. I've noticed that some people do not believe the 5.7mm or similar rounds are effective, and they keep using certain quotes as evidence. They originate from a forum post that Dr. Gary Roberts made. The non-italicized text is Gary Roberts' own comments, and he's clearly biased given the insults he uses. The first quote is just hearsay. It has no original source listed and comes from an anonymous soldier who said he used the 4.6mm MP7 in the US military. This soldier said that the problem with the 4.6 is that it took longer and more bullets for an enemy to realize that they are shot, and consequently make the decision to stop fighting. So the stated problem here boils down to a lack of psychological response, even though a lot of bullet wounds have been inflicted. Regardless of the cartridge you're using, you can't expect it to reliably give the psychological response that you'd like to see. Ultimately, the enemy that decides that psychological response. All you can control is the physical damage inflicted. Again, we have more hearsay. This quote involves statements from a SWAT officer who works at an unnamed federal agency. His complaint is that you have to use more rounds to stop a threat because of the minimal damage that 5.7 rounds do. He also says that there were 3 officer-involved shootings with P90s that they were issued that had unbelievably poor terminal ballistic performance, yet these 3 assailants were dropped quickly. In my view, having suspects being quickly killed with a particular round, and then you state that the round has extremely poor performance, these two things are mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. Assuming that poor terminal performance is an actual problem, it would almost certainly be caused by poor bullet design, because the cartridge itself is not lacking in the power department. As a side note, there's really no reason for Gary Roberts to be vague about what agency the SWAT officer works for. It's not like he even mentioned his name. Until I see verifiable evidence that 5.7 is actually lacking, I'm going to remain doubtful about these quotes. Let's say an agency has problems with a particular bullet not doing enough damage or not having enough penetration. All they have to do is switch to a different kind of ammunition. This is a chart I showed in a different video, and it demonstrates that 5.7 rounds can easily do more damage in animal tissue than a +P 9mm. Whether we are talking about 5.7s or 4.6mm, they're still handgun rounds, and they can obviously do less damage than a 5.56 rifle. Some people will even make the illogical argument that 5.7 lacks damage compared to rifles, so this is evidence that 5.7 is a bad handgun round. This quote, at least, isn't anonymous. Pat Rogers talks about how it takes more 5.7s or 4.6s to incapacitate someone. However, it doesn't state that Pat Rogers has any relevant experience shooting assailants with these calibers. This would make sense because neither the NYPD or the Marines issued such weapons when Pat Rogers was there. So this is just Pat Rogers' personal opinion stated as fact. This is a clear example of the logical fallacy known as the appeal to authority, because while Pat Rogers is an authority on different topics, he does not have authority on this topic. Sandy Wall of Houston SWAT has found the 5.7 cartridge to be effective. He's the only person mentioned so far that we have proof that he actually used a 5.7 in a gunfight. Houston SWAT also was the first law enforcement agency to use the P90 in a lethal engagement with a suspect. In this gunfight, the suspect was hit multiple times with both 5.56 and 5.7 rounds. After the gunfight, the autopsy provided detailed information about the 5.7 wounds inflicted, as well as the fact that none of the 5.7s exited. Doubts about the effectiveness of the 5.7 seem to be coming from the fear of the unknown, the fear that a smaller diameter bullet may not be as effective in a gunfight. However, verifiable real-world incidents should put this fear to rest. We can also look at the tragic terror attack on the Fort Hood military base to determine that yes, the 5.7 is easily capable of killing and causing extremely damaging wounds. During this attack, Sergeant Munley was shot in the leg. It was not until a couple of days later that the surgeons actually believed that the leg could be saved. She was also unconscious when she reached the hospital. So yes, the 5.7 is obviously capable of incapacitation through blood loss. For those of you who don't know, Munley was one of the 2 officers that shot the gunman and stopped the attack. There is even a case of 2 men illegally killing a grizzly sow with 2 5.7 pistols. They fired at least 40 times at the animal. Only 11 of those rounds actually hit the bear, and it was now badly wounded. Then one of them fired a final shot that finished off the bear. This is truly insane and reckless behavior in my opinion. There's also an interesting historical account of 36 caliber Colt Navy revolvers and 44 caliber Colt Army revolvers being used against a grizzly. As a point of reference, the 36 caliber rounds used are about as powerful as the .380. Of the 10 to 12 36 caliber round balls fired into the bear, not one of them had significant penetration. After going through the hide, they only made it about an inch into the flesh. In comparison, it took only 2 shots from a 44 Army Colt to actually kill the bear. These 44 rounds are more comparable in power to a 9mm, having roughly 330 foot-pounds of energy. So a 36 Navy Colt will give you great protection on the battlefield or in the saloon, but if you're in the back country where you may face a bear, a 44 Colt Army would be much better. I happen to have a picture of 2 44 caliber round balls that were fired into feral hogs. Note the massive deformation they have compared to the unfired projectile. If the 36 caliber balls mentioned before were made out of a harder lead alloy, they probably would have been more effective against the bear. Likewise, Elmer Keith shot an elk in the head with a soft point 30-40 Winchester revolver. The bullet expanded to about the size of a quarter and failed to reach the brain, or break the skull for that matter. He eventually broke the elk's neck with a hand-loaded round that had much better penetration. Even though the ammunition was at fault, Keith decided that he wouldn't use the 38-40 anymore because of this incident. I should also say that the 38-40 is not actually a small bullet, it's actually .40 caliber.